The International Energy Agency released its review of Canada's energy policies today, and it was a very, very interesting press conference. And Canada is kind of thought of as a climate laggard, a country that promises a lot and doesn't do much. But here's the headline on the IEA's press release. It's a bit of an eye-opener. Canada's bold policies and support for innovation can underpin a successful energy transition. Bold policies? Well, I'm going to talk to Mark Zacharias of Clean Energy Canada and a visiting professor at Simon Fraser University about that. Mark, welcome to the interview.
Great. Thanks for having me again.
It's a little bit of a reset, I think. This is, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been given some credit at the international level for being more forward thinking about climate policies, not so much talking about implementation yet, but but the policies are there. But the IEA coming out like this and setting Canada up as an example for other energy exporting countries, for example, isn't that kind of new?
It is. And, it's new for a number of reasons. I think this started last summer when the federal election platform for the Liberal Party of Canada came out, and it made a lot of bold promises. It was quite long, quite extensive, and it had in it a number of things that, we thought here at Clean Energy Canada we'd love to see, and we were very pleased to see them. I think Canada's doing four things right now that put it among the most ambitious nations worldwide. The first one, they're continuing carbon pricing. So the carbon price will escalate from $40 a ton now right up to $170 in 2030. And that'll put Canada among the most ambitious nations around carbon pricing. The second thing Canada has done, and there's three other signature policies, this is what we call them, under the plan, is they have an oil and gas emissions cap. So the Prime Minister committed that it would be capped at today's emissions, and then it would decline at some point over the coming years. We haven't seen the details yet of how that's going to work or how it's going to roll out. But again, that's incredibly ambitious, and I think it's achievable as well. The third policy that's come out that we're looking at and thinking it's an excellent idea is the zero emission vehicles sales mandate or standard that's coming out. And this will be 100% of light duty vehicles will need to be zero emission by 2035. In addition, they'll need to be MHDVs, so medium and heavy duty vehicles, 30% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. So again, those align and they're consistent with Europe and California and the other leading jurisdictions. And then the last, what we call signature policy that's out there right now that the government has committed to in its mandate letters is the Clean Electricity Standard. So this would be 100% non-emitting electricity by 2035. So taken together, and if government pulls those together and runs them to their natural conclusion and implements properly, as you just talked about, they should be able to get to their nationally determined contribution of 40 to 45% reduction in emissions by 2030.
Well, let's talk about the four recommendations that the IEA did make. The first one is to model pathways to net zero by 2050 for Canada's energy systems. And, think tanks in Canada have done that. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, for example, the Transition Accelerator. There have been others that have put out reports modeling decarbonization pathways. So it was very interesting for the IEA to say, now the government needs to do that.
Yeah, agreed. And I think government has been relying in some part around some of the work of the think tanks to kind of occupy this space. But I think there is a genuine federal intent to be able to figure out, like, how are we not only going to get to, for example, 100% clean electricity by 2035, but also we're going to need to double the amount of zero emission electricity by 2050. If we're going to be a net zero jurisdiction, that's going to take a lot of planning, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation and coordination between provinces, the federal government, utilities, indigenous nations, et cetera. So I think you're right. And I think the IEA correctly noted that this is a deficit that needs to be filled.
Now, the second recommendation was to, and this is an area in the last interview I did with you, we talked about East-West trade in electricity, and particular strengthening interties between provinces so that they can, say, for instance, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan could trade more electricity more easily. I thought that was a very interesting that they should point that out in one of their key recommendations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We noticed that as well. And we also noticed that in the federal mandate letters to the new ministers, they have the Pan-Canadian Grid Council to do exactly that. So leverage on some of the work that happened back in 2016 to 2018 around the federal provincial electricity planning, and also look at some of the successful examples like work going on around the Atlantic Loop in Eastern Canada, and try and export that type of success across the rest of Canada.
The third recommendation was to develop a comprehensive energy efficiency strategy. And of course, energy efficiency means doing more work with less energy. And we've had some success with that. Why would they single out, energy efficiency like that?
Well, Canada is an industrial nation. And if you look at all of our sectors that contribute to our GDP, people immediately think oil and gas and agriculture. We also have forest products. We have a fairly large manufacturing sector in Canada. Our second largest exports are autos and auto parts, and most people don't know that. So we are an economy that is industrial. And so there are opportunities to find efficiencies in all of that. And again, if you look at some of the work that's been happening over the last year, the federal government has a fund called the Net Zero Accelerator, currently has $8 billion in it right now. And it's looking at what we call the low-hanging fruit. So it's looking at very large single source emitters like steel, like cement, and going after those. So knocking off those facilities that are the highest emitting in Canada and electrifying their processes. So we think it's the right thing to do, and we think the IEA correctly, identified this as a key need. I think the other thing to remember too is we are a northern climate. So the more we can make our buildings, for example, efficient, the more we are going to be likely to hit our climate targets.
Now, the fourth recommendation is to increase federal funding in support of accelerating R&D and innovation of clean energy technologies. You mentioned one such fund, but the federal government has actually created pots of money for other kinds of R&D and clean energy, clean tech development, haven't they?
Yeah, they've got numerous funding pots across numerous ministries, all generally geared at the same aim, which is to improve our export competitiveness, build and scale up industries in Canada, and while doing so is transition to a cleaner and low carbon economy. One of the barriers that we are seeing with the federal government is we're not sure that all of these funding pots are necessarily coordinated at the same time. And then also some of the investments, we're not sure that there is going to be a good rate of return on. We know the federal government in some provinces, for example, are very interested in small modular nuclear reactors. But again, the technology is unproven. We don't expect to see the first reactor in place probably until 2030. We really don't know, A, what the costs are going to be, and B, whether the public are going to accept these things in their communities. So that just gives you an example of the types of R&D going on. We've also noticed that recently the federal government, and it was noted in the IEA report, around their investments in carbon capture and storage. And again, to reduce the emissions intensity of oil and gas industry, where you would store excess CO2 or CO2 as a byproduct of refining and put it back underground. Again, it's been done, and it is being done in Alberta and Saskatchewan right now. But whether we can scale up that technology such that it's material to reducing Canada's emissions, it's really hard to tell at this point. So there's a few unknowns out there in this space.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. And I'm these days I'm using the terminology that I borrowed from Jason Dion's study on decarbonization pathways at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, where he talks about safe bets like electric vehicles and renewables that are economic today, and then wildcards like small modular reactors that we should keep investing in to see if, in fact, they can be made economic and practical down the road. It seems to me, Mark, that in a way, this is what one of Fatih Birol, who, the executive director of the IEA, who was on the press conference today, kept talking about opportunities, at the switch from the fossil fuel economy over to the clean energy economy. He saw Canada's strategy as being the right one to take advantage of the opportunities that are being created in the transformation of the global energy system. What do you think of that?
It was a good observation by the IEA. So Canada has a two-track pathway to 2050. The first track with the oil and gas sector is to be able to reduce emissions from the sector as much as you can over probably the next decade and a half. And a lot of the investments that you've seen from the federal government over the last couple of months have been kind of geared towards that. Make our industries more efficient so that we can compete in global markets with a low carbon oil and gas product. And then the second path in the federal strategy is to actually transition away from oil and gas at some point. I mean, the writing on the wall for the industry is fairly clear. Sometime after 2030 or 2040, oil and gas production globally is going to be declining. The IEA has concluded this. You look at the investment community and the divestment movement, they've seen this as well. So Canada needs to finally balance how much investment is going to make now in reducing the footprint of oil and gas industries that aren't going to be here a couple of decades from now, versus actually looking at our economy around what are the industries of the future, what are the industries of the low carbon world, where are they going to go? Fortunately, Canada, we're not a one-trick pony. We have a strong ag sector. We've got forest products. We've got manufacturing. We've got a skilled workforce. We've got good universities. We've got governments that tend to work together and are forward thinking. So we are incredibly blessed with opportunity to transition to that clean economy. We also have a grid, an electricity grid that's 83% non-emitting. Compare that to 37% in the US, and you can see why most of our export products are lower carbon than our competitors. So the issue for Canada is, when do we act? When do we really start putting the investments in that long-term economy for those industries that are going to be growing after 2040, versus investing in industries that we know aren't going to be here 10 or 20 years from now? So it's a fine balance, and the federal government's got its work cut out for them.
Let's wrap up our conversation, Mark, with the discussion of the net zero by 2050 approach that Canada is taking. More and more, I'm hearing chatter around on social media and amongst the experts that I interview that net zero by 2050 is doable. Now, it may not be. I guess it remains to be seen whether the policies will be in place to do that globally. But there's increasing confidence that Canada can be, that in Canada, net zero by 2050 is doable.
Absolutely. And, if you look at the various modeling consultancies out there that are working on these problems, it certainly looks doable. We have industries that, for the most part, we can switch to low carbon processes or even net zero processes. We have, again, we talked about the skilled workforce. We've got all of the academic know-how. We've got a clean tech sector that is already mature in Canada and fairly large. We can scale up. And once we switch our electricity grid to 100% non-emitting, that provides a huge jumping off point to decarbonize the rest of the economy. And again, some of the policies the federal government has come out with around, zero emission vehicles, 100% by 2035. Those are the types of things that are going to get us there. So I'm actually pretty hopeful that net zero is achievable for Canada.
Great, Mark. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.